I will confidently say that Ethereum is not going to flip Bitcoin. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. You know, the reality is that Ethereum hasn't even gone remotely close to where it was in June of 2017 in terms of its high against Bitcoin, right? So while it has made sense to be bullish on ETH Bitcoin the last few months, and while I think there's likely going to be a pullback in September and October, and maybe then another rally by Ethereum against Bitcoin after that, I do think it remains useful to be, try to keep a level head about this and be like, look guys, just because we're in a phase where Ethereum might outperform Bitcoin off and on, it does not mean it's going to flip it, right? Like, in fact, the likelihood is very low. There's also a really high chance ETH puts in a lower high compared to last cycle, right? So like, to me, it really makes no sense to call for the flippening.
Rate cuts are coming, but history shows they don't save altcoins. September and October are usually when the cracks show. Let's break down why Bitcoin tends to reclaim the spotlight as the year closes. Many people are pointing to rate cuts as a reason why altcoins might rally. And yes, odds are high we'll see another cut in September, but here's the problem: past cuts haven't done much for altcoin pairs. Just look back at late 2024, the Fed was cutting, but by October, altcoin pairs still rolled over hard. Right now, all eyes are on Jerome Powell's speech at Jackson Hole this Friday. Investors are expecting him to hint at cuts in September, but Ben Cowen says you don't even have to wait for Powell. The charts are already telling the story. Bitcoin dominance appears to be bottoming out. Momentum indicators reveal strength beneath the surface even as the price has been drifting lower. That usually signals a shift. Most likely, dominance grinds sideways through August, then starts climbing in September and October as capital rotates back into Bitcoin. Meanwhile, Bitcoin's correction gained momentum after reports that the SEC is investigating fraud and stock manipulation at Alt 5 Sigma. The same company struck a $1.5 billion deal with Trump's World Liberty Financial. That headline only added pressure to an already shaky market. But zoom out, and this isn't new. Cowen notes that this occurs almost every year. Altcoin pairs rally in June, stall out, and then fade into the fall. Whether they make one last push higher before rolling over doesn't matter much. The bigger picture remains the same. September and October are typically when altcoins lose momentum and Bitcoin begins to attract investors back. Make sure to tune in for our expert analysis. Don't miss out on future content. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay in the loop. Your support is greatly appreciated.
There is a scenario where all Bitcoin pairs do something like this, right? Where they rally up and then drop in September. There's also a chance that it's playing out kind of like it did right here, where you have sort of an initial low, right? And then you have this sort of knee-jerk reaction move back up where it sweeps that one and goes back down. So there's no guarantee that it will sweep the high up here. It could also just do something like this where it doesn't really go up, but it also doesn't really roll over until September. But that's what I'm thinking. Now, a lot of people have said, well, what about rate cuts? Like, we're probably going to have a rate cut in September. If you go over to the watch tool, if we just reload the page to get sort of the more recent data, about an 85% chance there's going to be a rate cut. Now, if there's an 85% chance there's going to be a rate cut, why would altcoins not go up on their Bitcoin pairs? Well, when there was a rate cut in September of 2024, what you'll notice, in that time frame is that alt Bitcoin pairs were doing okay, right? They were doing okay, but then by October, November, they more obviously started to roll over. And so the reason why I don't think the rate cuts have had the effects on alt Bitcoin pairs that people thought they were going to, and I've said this before, I think that the Fed funds rate is still greater than R star. Now, R star is the neutral rate, and the neutral rate is this abstract interest rate. If the Fed funds rate is above, then the economy is slowing down, and if the Fed funds rate is below, then the economy is expanding. So you could argue that the reason why alt Bitcoin pairs still collapsed near the after rate cuts in 2024 was because the Fed funds rate was still higher than the neutral rate, right? So, I mean, yeah, it's great that they got 25 basis points, 50 basis points, whatever. But, in all, there was 100 basis points of rate cuts. But you could argue that, it still isn't below the neutral rate. Now, the neutral rate is an abstract number or a concept, right? We don't actually know what the neutral rate is. But the prevailing opinion, one of the prevailing opinions for the neutral rate, is that it's just equivalent, roughly, to the 2-year yield, right? Now, the 2-year yield right now is at 3.75%, but interest rates are at 4.5%. So even if we get a rate cut in September to say 4.25%, you're still looking at around a 50 basis point delta between the Fed funds rate and the theoretical neutral rate. So the reason why I think you'll see alt Bitcoin pairs drop in September and October is because while the rate cuts will happen, they still won't get us to the point where we can say the Fed funds rate at that point is lower than the neutral rate, right? So I think right now the Fed funds rate is higher than the neutral rate. And until the Fed funds rate drops below the 2-year yield, you could argue that we remain in restrictive territory. So I think that is one of the things that needs to be considered. That doesn't mean that on any given day you can't see all Bitcoin pairs go up in September. And maybe on the day they cut rates, perhaps they do. But the reality is that until the Fed funds rate gets a lot lower, you're still likely going to eventually see those altcoins roll over against Bitcoin. And one of the things that we've also mentioned quite a bit with Bitcoin dominance is that, you know, it's likely going to start surging again in September and October. That doesn't mean it can't go lower just yet, right? Like there are some sort of divergences forming. If you look at say like these weekly candles and you just simply connect the dots on them, you can see that, you know, we're kind of getting near that support level. It doesn't mean you can't wick below it, but we're getting near it. If you look at say like the RSI on the daily, what you'll notice is that, you know, Bitcoin dominance here on the daily looks to be gaining strength in terms of the RSI, despite Bitcoin dominance having gone lower, right? So there's this divergence forming. You're seeing dominance, the underlying, you know, the underlying part of it looks like it's starting to get a little bit stronger and is likely going to start moving up again in September, October, but it hasn't happened yet. But you can kind of see that strength is starting to shift, right? So I would say the timing for dominance to go lower would be for whatever, you know, the remainder of August. That doesn't mean that it has to go lower for the remainder of August, but I would say the reason I don't think you're seeing it really move up yet is because I don't think the next rotation back to Bitcoin away from altcoins will happen until September, okay? And again, you know, if you go look at alt Bitcoin pairs in general, we've seen that happen many, many times where, you know, you'll see a rally in, this is June of 2022, June of 2023, June of 2024, and now June of 2025. You'll have these rallies, but then a lot of times, you know, and every single time so far, we eventually see it roll over as we get, you know, a little bit later into the year, early next year. So I could totally see, you know, a scenario where all Bitcoin pairs still try to stay elevated, you know, for some of the remainder of the month, and then likely drop in September, October. I don't know for sure if they're going to sweep this high on this rally or not. It could be a high that is swept in like November or December. But what I would say is if you do see all Bitcoin pairs sweep this high, then that would likely be the turnaround point, if not before, right? If not before.
Every time Ethereum rallies, people start calling for the flippening. That moment ETH overtakes Bitcoin. However, history tells a different story, and Ben Cowen suggests that this fall could remind us why Bitcoin remains at the top. Cowen notes that ETH/BTC may still have some room to run in the short term. Altcoins in general could also push a bit higher, but you should be mentally prepared for weakness once we move into the fall. That's usually when Bitcoin tags its 20-week moving average and dominance starts to reverse. Could it happen sooner, maybe even in August? Sure. But September is the more likely window. Ethereum has had a solid bid, no question. However, seasonality suggests that Bitcoin dominance will bounce back as we head into September. That doesn't guarantee a new high, though Cowen doesn't rule it out either. ETH/BTC will likely set a higher low. But the real question is how strong that low is. That strength or lack thereof will determine whether Bitcoin dominance reaches a new high, and this is where Cowen throws some cold water on the hype. Every time Ethereum gets a rally, people rush to call for ETH to flip Bitcoin. But the long-term structure doesn't support that. ETH has put in higher lows, yes, but Bitcoin is still number one for a reason, and according to Cowen, it's going to stay that way. Let's get back to the interview.
I think the base case here for dominance is that it's sort of going down here into September, and then you're likely going to see it reverse out of it, where then that liquidity goes from the altcoin market back into Bitcoin. And so what you'll likely see ETH Bitcoin get a sizable correction in the September to October timeframe, right? That at least would be my base case. I mean, like the ETH Bitcoin valuation, while I think it still likely has room to rally, I think we are going to be coming up on a period where it will show some weakness again, kind of like it did back over here in in May and June. I think we'll see that same type of thing in September and October. So I would say be mentally prepared for weakness by ETH against Bitcoin in September and October. Same thing for altcoins. I think you'll see that rotation back to Bitcoin. And then there's a good chance that then Bitcoin will find its 20-week moving average in September, would be my base case, right? And again, I mean, it always could happen in August, right? Like, I'm not saying it's impossible for it to happen in August, but, you know, I could see a scenario where, like, Bitcoin just sweeps this low here and then comes back up for a little bit and then comes down into that bull market support band. And that could be kind of around the time that the Bitcoin dominance really starts to reverse course. So, you know, Bitcoin dominance has had one hell of a rally this cycle. And I think it's important to remember that seasonality for dominance, you know, when it's going down in July and August, I think it makes sense to assume that it'll likely reverse in the month of September. And so, you know, I've talked about it a few times over the last few weeks, and I probably won't make another video on dominance until closer to September. But just remember, dominance has dropped a lot in a relatively short period of time, right? It was literally like 66% not even 2 months ago. And altcoins are trying, right? Like, they certainly have given it a good bid. And I mean, obviously Ethereum has done incredibly well, but I think you're going to see a bounce here by dominance as we get into the month of September. Doesn't mean it has to go to new high, right? It does not, but I wouldn't fade that idea either, right? The reason why it doesn't have to is because ETH Bitcoin will likely put in a higher low. It depends on where that higher low is as to, you know, if Bitcoin dominance puts in a higher high or not again. So watch this chart, watch for it to potentially sort of reverse down here in September and come back up this way. And then from that point, it'll make more sense to try to talk about whether it's a lower high, whether it's a higher high. A lot of that will depend on the strength of ETH against Bitcoin. And I mean, at the time, it'll likely look like ETH is weak against Bitcoin when that happens. But just keep in mind how far it has come. I've also seen, and I'll just go ahead and say this now, because what's a video about Bitcoin dominance of not pissing someone off? There's a lot of people in sort of the Ethereum community I've seen recently start calling for the flippening again. I would very caution people against that idea. The reality that I think everyone needs to accept at this point is that while ETH Bitcoin has been putting in higher lows from one cycle to another, it's also been putting in lower highs. Okay, so I think it makes sense to move the conversation away from the flippening stuff, right? I mean, like, it's crazy to me that all it takes is like a few month rally for Ethereum for everyone to start calling for the flippening again. Really good chance Ethereum is likely not ever going to flip Bitcoin, okay? And I will confidently say that Ethereum is not going to flip Bitcoin. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But in my mind, it makes no sense to assume that. And so if you find yourself falling into that trap, thinking that that's going to play out, just remember that, like, every time people call for that, it ends up not even happening. And you know, the reality is that Ethereum hasn't even gone remotely close to where it was in June of 2017 in terms of its high against Bitcoin, right? So while it has made sense to be bullish on ETH Bitcoin the last few months, and while I think there's likely going to be a pullback in September and October, and maybe then another rally by Ethereum against Bitcoin after that, I do think it remains useful to be, you know, try to keep a level head about this and be like, look, guys, just because we're in a phase where Ethereum might outperform Bitcoin off and on, it does not mean it's going to flip it, right? Like, in fact, the likelihood is very low. There's also a really high chance ETH puts in a lower high compared to last cycle, right? So like it to me it really makes no sense to call for the flippening, especially when you're looking at lower highs from one cycle to another, right? 2017, you had ETH Bitcoin all the way up at 0.15, and then in 2018 it was 0.12, and then in 2021 it was 0.088, and then in 2022 0.085. And so like nothing about this chart would make me think that Ethereum is on its path to flip anything, right? In terms of, or flip Bitcoin. What it makes me think is that you're likely going to just be looking at another lower high. And potentially, I mean, obviously you've also had a series of higher lows, but that's why when we get into sort of these dominance talks, a lot of people don't like it because they want to see their altcoin, flip Bitcoin or do something. But reality is Bitcoin is number one for a reason. It will stay number one, and Bitcoin dominance will likely bounce in the September to October timeframe.
Cycles in crypto tend to repeat, and once again the signs are aligning in a way that echoes past transitions. Liquidity may slosh around the smaller tokens for a while, but as the calendar flips toward fall, the gravity of the market's anchor asset usually asserts itself. Seasonality, structural dominance, and the weight of investor preference all indicate that capital is likely to drift back towards safer harbors. When volatility rises, rate decisions and regulatory headlines can create short-term noise, but the larger pattern appears to be rooted in repetition. Strength in summer often gives way to rotation by autumn. Will this year follow the same seasonal script, pulling capital away from speculative altcoins and funneling it back toward the asset that continues to set the standard? Share your perspective in the comment section. If the video resonates with you, join our community by subscribing to our channel and enabling notifications with the bell icon. Thank you for being a part of our community.